Now, Fox News host Tucker Carlson on populism and the future of the Republican Party. From the National Review Institute Ideas Summit, this is a half hour.
Hi, I'm Michael Brendan Dougherty. I met our next guest 14 years ago. I was a nobody who just moved to Washington to avoid law school or even graduating college at all. And when I landed a job that had any letterhead at all, I wrote letters to people whose writing I liked, and one of them was Tucker. And I told him a story. 3 years earlier, I'd been in a Borders bookstore, and I saw his book, Politicians, Partisans, and Parasites, My Adventures in Cable News. And I had 20 bucks. That was all the disposable income I had. So I picked up the book, I sat in a chair in Borders, I read it cover to cover, and I put it back on the shelf. So I wrote him a letter and I told him this story. I put it back on the shelf because my friend had called me earlier and he said, "You gotta see Lost in Translation. It's peak Scarlett Johansson." So I told this story in a letter, I sent it to Tucker. He doesn't know who I am, I'm a nobody. I get a call 2 days later from Tucker, and he says, "You made the right choice." And he said, "And I respect the hell out of you. Let's get lunch." And one of the stars of Tucker's book was a congressman you may remember, Jim Traficant. Anyone remember? He's a House Democrat from Youngstown, Ohio. And when television hosts like Robert Novak addressed him, Congressman Traficant, he would interrupt and say, "Don't call me names." Then he'd start wobbling in his seat, stare directly into the camera, and he would dare the Justice Department to go after him again and vow to take them down. He would lower his head sometimes and speak directly into his microphone and say something like, "Dick Gephardt doesn't have the anatomy to come and see me." So I already knew from cable television that Jim Traficant was a great man. But Tucker's book showed me the whole side of him, that Jim Traficant was the last man in Congress who was proud to come on television stone drunk. So a drunkard, a tax evader, the guy who's basically the last founding father of our country. And Carlson mentions an incident where, coming off the set, he lunges at a 22-year-old producer, says, "Hug me." And she refuses, and he just screams at her, "You goddamn communist!" Anyway, I love Jim.
Which she was, by the way.
So, my first question for Tucker is, when did you first start to think that crazy drunken lech was onto something about trade with China?
It took many years. I like Traficant because he was interesting, he thought for himself, and he really had the quality that, as a talk show host, I value most, which is availability. He didn't have a lot going on, so he was willing to come on at a moment's notice, and we're grateful for that. Remain that way. But no, the trade portion of his platform, if you could call it that, took a while for me to understand, and I'm still kind of assessing. I'm not exactly sure what I think even today, but I've always thought that in a society that demands conformity, and increasingly our society does, it's the floridly crazy people who are likely to see the truth. Not the whole truth, no one but God can see that, but flashes of it, who might say something that hadn't occurred to me. And from a young age, I was really, I would say my one advantage is I was really aware of the sameness of the world that I grew up in. I mean, I grew up in La Jolla and then Georgetown and kind of stayed here. So it's not like, you know, I had a variety of life experiences to draw on. So I've always been interested in listening to people with other experiences. And I've always been open to the idea that what I assume is true as a matter of faith is like completely wrong, because it has been a number of times. And so I always listen to Traficant. I listen to the schizophrenics on the bus. Not that I ride the bus, but if I, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
I talk to people on airplanes, and the farther out you are, and by the way, in Washington, again, it is increasingly true, though it always has been true, the more sort of reviled you are, the more sort of written off you are by all the cool kids, the more likely you are to be saying at least something that's true. And here's how you always know. The people who are a threat to the way things are almost never engaged directly. You almost never hear the following, well, you know, he made a point, and that's wrong for these 6 reasons. It's always, that guy's a nutcase. You know, racist, he's a bigot. Okay, yeah, I'm sure he is. Lots of people, you know, whatever. I'm not that interested, actually. Like, what is he saying? Do you know, can you rebut the case that he is making to the extent he's making one? Like, what's wrong with the idea he just threw up in the air? And people don't want to engage at all. And Traficant made it very easy for them not to want. I mean, he was basically like a mafia member, actually. Last thing I'll say about Traficant, because I can't resist, he was sheriff of Mahoning County, I think, in Mahoning Valley there, and he was indicted, federal indictment for corruption, and he chose to defend himself. And at trial, before he made it to Congress, and at trial, he was presented with all these wiretaps and basically irrefutable evidence he'd been taking payoffs and buying things, big things like Cadillacs and a farm with these payoffs. And so they asked him, you know, what was this? And he said, well, it was a sting operation. I was running a sting operation. And they said, well, did you tell your wife? You know, like where the money came from, the new car and the farm. And he goes, you can't trust anyone in Youngstown. That's actually, check the transcript, he really said that, and he was acquitted and elected to Congress. And he died in the most manly way possible, which was his ride-on mower flipped over backwards and crushed him. Think of the alternatives. It's actually not such a bad way to go. You got your shoes on. So I always like to.
So there's no good transition from that to this. Okay. You know, the headline out of Youngstown yesterday is actually quite sad, which is that Youngstown, Ohio is going through a problem where cocaine is flowing through the town and it's cut with fentanyl. And that was a problem that snuck up, I think, on people. It was just in the New York Times one day, a study had been done, and white men, particularly white working class men, are dying at a much faster rate. In fact, their mortality is declining at a rate unseen since World War I. You've talked about...
It's infuriating.
You've talked a little bit about how you are in Washington much of the time, which is glittering, it's getting richer all the time. The home values are going up all the time in every county around it. But you also go to Western Maine. Was that something that clued you in, that maybe...
Oh, yeah, it had a huge effect on my life, on my politics, on the way I see the country. Yeah, I've gone to the same little town my whole life. One of the poorer counties, one of the poorest counties on the East Coast, beautiful place. And I've watched it dissolve. I mean, the culture there, there's wonderful people. I spend 3 months a year there every year. And you watch the same very familiar pathologies that we wrote a lot about in the 80s and 90s in the inner city, right in the middle of this overwhelmingly conservative, 100% white, rural community. And you start to ask yourself, like, well, why is this happening? Is it because they just, is welfare doing this? Well, I'm not sure that our assistance programs make it better. I think they undermine the family in a lot of ways. But they're not the problem. I mean, they didn't cause this. Actually, they're exacerbating it. They didn't cause it. And what caused it was the collapse of male jobs. And we should have learned this. And it actually has made me reassess a little bit. Not my feelings about watching the family collapse in inner city America. I still feel that's a disaster. It demonstrably has been a disaster. There's really sort of no other way to look at it. But the causes are a little different from what I thought. Like, if men don't have full-time work, families fall apart. If men make less than women, women don't want to marry them. This is not some Handmaid's Tale-like talking point that we in the alt-right believe. This is the product of like a century of consistent social science. And by the way, I wish it weren't true. I wish women were very excited to marry overweight, indolent men who played video. I'm serious.
Tucker, what do you...
No. I'm serious. I wish it were enough to sort of be charming at dinner. But it's not, actually. And that's not a choice that men make. It's an instinct that women have. And it's true over time across population, race, income. So like clearly this is a feature of human nature. So if you're mad about it, kind of not my problem. At some point you have to address people as they are, which is my basic problem with a lot of what happens in Washington. It does not address human nature, which is immutable. It's the one thing that doesn't change. And so if you have a society where, on average, women make more than men, you will see a very predictable series of events. Women will stop getting married. They will not stop having children, by the way. That's a biological imperative. They will continue to do that, but those children will not have a father in the home over large populations. And that's exactly, and then everything else that happens, which as conservatives we're very familiar with, because we spend a lot of time moralizing about it. I certainly have, a lot of time. And we spend almost no time asking, like, how can we make this better? So if you have a society where the only full-time employers, and this is true in Western Maine, and it's true in much of rural America, are the hospitals and the schools, you have to ask yourself, like, you know, can you have a functioning society, the basis of which is always the nuclear family, always, in such a place? And the answer is no, you can't. So I don't know why we're not spending more time on this. I also don't know why, you know, these stats come in every day, and we have a couple people on our show who are really interested in this stuff, share my interest in it, and so they're constantly sending me this stuff. I just got one today. So there's, of course, the life expectancy numbers, 3 years in a row down. I mean, if that's not a red alert, I'm not sure what is. The suicide numbers are my fixation. I know 4 different people have killed themselves in the last year and a half, all middle-aged men. And if you're, I'm going to be 50 in May, if you're roughly my age, ask yourself if you don't know people who've killed themselves recently. You probably do, because the epidemic is that widespread. And by the way, these are affluent people too. Something's going on. There's no interest in what that might be. But the statistic that I got today, which I think is, and I don't care how it sounds because I think it's real. Out today, 2 hours ago, new study shows that the number of men under 30 who report having no sex at all ever has risen by 3-fold in 10 years. So I'm reading this and I'm thinking, I'm a social conservative, just for the record, a pretty strident one actually. My first thought was, well, porn. That was my first thought, which I think is bad. I do. But that's not it. I thought, what society does that remind me of? It reminds me of the Middle East, actually. One of the core problems in the Middle East, and we lay this at the feet of polygamy, but it's deeper than that, is that the economic stratification is so profound that only the rich people get to mate. And you have a huge population of young men who don't have mates. Now, I'm sorry if it makes you uncomfortable, but it's just true because, again, it's nature, and the farther away you get from nature, the farther off course you are. Nature tells you, and your life experience tells you, you don't want a large population of celibate men. That is a recipe for instability. For chaos, actually. It's a dangerous group to have. You better be, you're lucky. No wonder everyone's pushing weed on the population. I'm not joking, because they're afraid. And so what that is a picture of, it's a picture of a society in which the spoils increasingly go to a smaller or shrinking really number of people. And your average young person, that's the poorest segment of our society, is young people, don't have enough to buy a car or a house. They're shackled to student loans from which they cannot escape. And they don't have enough to mate. And one of the reasons is because they're living with their parents. We have a higher percentage of young men living with their parents than in my lifetime by far. That's an economic question. Now, I'm not espousing socialism, obviously, which I abhor and which does not work, at least in the way that it's been administered in every country that I'm aware of. What I'm saying is we're going to get something really radical and destructive and dangerous unless we address these things. That's the only point I made.
Now, you say you're not a populist. You grew up in in a nice area. You grew up, you live among the elites. You like your home in Washington.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah. And, but your book, you know, your recent book, Ship of Fools, you kind of trace this to the idea that it was Democrats who gave up on Youngstown. That was, of course, Traficant's accusation, right? And
right.
He said, he warned Al Gore, don't even come near me or come near Youngstown.
Right.
And they made the transition very quickly, and now Democrats and liberals, they love the largest corporations in America, right? They love Facebook, they love Apple.
They worship power.
Well, it's as succinct as you can put it. What should be the conservative response when you see a supposedly liberal party or a progressive party that's dominated by elites at the top who love corporate power, who themselves are winning more and more votes from the upwardly mobile part of America? And even though the Republican Party has almost tried to repel working class whites from coming in, and in some cases working class Latinos from coming in, they seem to be coming into the party. So what is the role of a conservative in America right now?
Or working class black men, by the way, if I could just say the obvious.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I mean, there's no reason that African American men shouldn't be voting for a party that rejects rigid 1970s era feminism, or that stands for due process in the rule of law. I mean, there's just no reason. And one of the reasons you see such chaos in our politics right now is because the terms haven't been defined. Sort of nobody sort of knows where we are. I mean, you had the party of the factory owners versus the party of the workers, and now they've inverted, but the leaderships don't really understand that this has happened, and they don't want it to happen, actually, certainly on the Republican side. I mean, they you know, my whole lifetime, you would hear people say, oh, it's the party of the country club. And you'd be like, well, that's appalling, that's totally untrue. And you'd retreat to the bar at Round Hill and be like, you know, I can't believe they're saying that. It was totally true. And by the way, and you're absolutely, I am not a populist. I think populism is not sustainable. Populism isn't a form of government. It's a warning sign that you've got bad elites. You will always have elites because people are hierarchical. It's in their nature. Dogs are hierarchical. Do you have any? You know that. There's a head dog. There has to be a head dog, period. It's just the way we're made, okay? So every society is hierarchical, including Venezuela and Sweden and the former Soviet Union. I mean, you're not getting around that. The only meaningful question is, how are your elites? Are they impressive? Are they wise? Are they making decisions that help people, or aren't they? And so my critique is really simple. We had a populist election last time, and that ought to be a terrifying wake-up call to anyone who's benefiting from our society right now. If you want to keep what you have, and I do, then you need to pay attention to the forces that gave rise to this thing. Don't ignore it, because it won't get better. It's like appendicitis. It's one of those rare things you can't ignore, I would say.
So what would you say to people who, you know, resist that argument? They say, okay.
I have contempt for them.
Well, we'll pretend that.
Oh, sorry.
We'll pretend we don't know what I'm quoting from National Review on Tucker Carlson. You know, they'll say, look at the unemployment rate. The basics of America, you can still get a job. In fact, more people are getting jobs now. Wages are going up. You know, we're seeing this slack in the economy we didn't know was there, that more men are coming into the workforce, you know, and that you're selling victimhood populism. You're telling people that need to learn how to show up at work on time, the basic skills to get a job, that it's someone else's fault, someone in Washington, someone distant, because you have to keep people's eyeballs on the TV screen because there are commercials to run. And that's the business. And
that's a pretty low explanation for it. I mean, I would say this. One, I hope not ever to whine or encourage people to be victims. I hate that. I won't tolerate it in my house. I won't allow my children to ever blame anybody for anything that's even remotely their fault. I'm an Episcopalian. I hate whining more than anything. I hate complaining. My goal in life is to die with dignity without whining about it. So I hate whining more than anything.
Well, you got to get a bigger mower.
No, I'm not joking. So if I'm abetting whining or encouraging whining, my gosh, my apologies. I don't mean to. I will say it's amazing to me to be lectured about the market by people who work for nonprofits. I've worked for nonprofits. I've run a nonprofit, so I'm not against nonprofits, okay? But you know, if you haven't been fired because your boss has decided that you're not making enough money for the company, get back to me after that's happened. It gives you a little, that's happened to me a couple of times. It hasn't made me a genius or anything, but it's given me a little perspective. So, like, I just noticed that the people who are more, who are the most sort of vocal in favor of the, untrammeled free markets, A, can't define what that is, and B, wouldn't know it if it got in the shower with them. They have no personal experience of it. So, I'm not arguing for, all I'm arguing for is a clear sight picture of what the goal is. That's all I'm arguing for. Okay, I'm not arguing for a different economic system. I'm not arguing for higher taxes on anybody. I'm not exactly sure what I'm arguing for. I'm not a policy guy. I'm a talk show host. But I sincerely believe that no problem is solved unless you have a very clear image in your mind of what you want the result to be. What are we shooting for? All this, trillions of dollars in the American economy, all this effort and IQ points focused on public policy. When it's all done, what do you seek to have? And the vision that I have for this country may be different from the one you have, but what I'm arguing on behalf of is a system where people who have no special advantage, including cognitive, people with an IQ of 100 who make 70 grand a year, have got 3 kids, living no place special, who don't know anybody, can have sort of a decent life. I'm not hoping they're all going to become entrepreneurs, whatever that is. I hope that talking point has died. It's too stupid. Most people are not going to be entrepreneurs. They can't pronounce it. It's like some French thing. That's not the goal, is entrepreneurship for the masses. And shame on us for claiming otherwise. The goal is to have just like a normal life. And not a guarantee that your kids will do better than you, but a reasonable, plausible hope of it. I'll tell you what the goal is demonstrably not. A country where the suicide rate is going up. You can throw any numbers you want at me. I don't care what the GDP is. I definitely don't care what your fake unemployment statistics say, because they're fake. And I really don't care what your inflation numbers say, the fakest numbers of all. All I care about is how people are doing. Think of it like your kids. You could be like, well, I don't know, you went to Choate and Middlebury. You're fine. It's like I'm on the verge of killing myself. I'm sorry, you didn't hear me. You went to Choate and Middlebury. You're fine. And it's like maybe the steps that you thought would produce the result that you desired were the wrong steps, or who knows what happened, but it doesn't matter because we're not getting to where we need to be.
Right. If you have a 23-year-old kid and you say, hey, this 23-year-old kid has a mid-6-figure GDP, and we count it in all the college debt that he has.
Or whatever. Maybe it's not primarily economic, or maybe there's something in the food. I mean, honestly, why are testosterone levels going down? Really? What happens when they go down? I mean, get to 50 and you know what I mean? It's like, that's a disaster. Is NIH on this? No, not at all. It's not interested. Sperm counts, way down. But we're like, oh, we can't talk. Really? Are you interested in continuing the species? Like, these are the most basic markers of how you're doing. Life and death, like, that's all that matters. And we're completely ignoring that in favor of the most abstract, cooked, stupid, totally immaterial numbers. They don't tell us anything. Those numbers tell us a lot. They don't tell us what the solutions are, but they tell us what the conversation should be. And so my only role as a non-public policy person, as a person with a completely unimpressive academic record, though now I feel like that maybe that's something I should be bragging about more, is to try and just start the conversation on those questions. And it's amazing to me how hostile the reception is when you bring that up. And that tells you everything right there. Oh, shut up. You're just doing it for ratings. Really? If I was just doing ratings, we'd do the Benghazi show every day. You know what I mean? Like, really? No. I sincerely mean it. Do I seem like I don't mean it? Do I seem like I'm pretending to be a populist? Why would I be a populist? Do you know what I mean? Like, none of this stuff affects me personally, just to be totally clear about it. I'm always going on about immigration, not because it has a single downside in my life. Not one. Not a single one. I mean, the biggest downside is my neighbors hate me for it because it's like a threat to their nannies. Okay. I just really think it's true. Like, why else would I say it?
So so that's your role as a talk show host. As a citizen, as someone who's been identified as a conservative in the public, as someone who used to wear bow ties on television.
Yeah, can you imagine?
I mean, listen, I remember,
I'm denying that, come on now.
Come on. I remember my own mother watching you on Politically Incorrect, and she said, do you know what that bow tie looks like? A middle finger waved in my face.
That is totally true. Your mother was a wise woman because
I know.
that was its effect, I can promise you.
I've come to understand it.
Yeah, try it.
She wasn't happy when I wrote to you, by the way. But okay, so that's your role as a talk show host. But as a citizen, as someone who's a public conservative, as someone who has had God knows how many chicken dinners with other conservatives, nonprofit and otherwise, what do you want from the party, the Republican Party? Do you want them to take up some of the causes or rhetoric abandoned by the left, make the other wing of American politics work and saying, hey, Uber uses a trick. Its employees are counted as contractors, and so it owes them nothing. And so the primary way they make money in life is a way in which there are no actual obligations from the other side.
I want to celebrate that as entrepreneurship, so we can continue to be lectured by Travis and other teenage billionaires about our own moral failings. Yeah, no, those people are disgusting, and I think we should say so out loud. There's no reason that we should always take the side of the ugliest kinds of capitalism. That doesn't, in the end, amount to a defense of capitalism. It discredits it. And I think capitalism is worth defending. So why are we defending payday lenders? You know what I mean? But what I really want the party to do and our society to do is focus on making it possible for people to have kids. I'm serious. And you see this in the Republican Party, which I think is very close to the point of just being like so useless that it'll start over. You see it on that. So the Republicans look at the numbers, and they're fine at numbers, usually the wrong numbers, but whatever. And they look at the numbers and they're like, okay, our basic demographic, as we say in television, is aging, shrinking. We need to bring some new people into this coalition, or else we're never going to win anything. So we need to bring African Americans, Latinos, Asians, immigrants into this thing. How do we do that? So then Frank Luntz shows up and he's like, I've got a good idea. Just be super liberal in immigration. They'll love that. And all the dumb people in the Congress are like, yeah, that's a good idea. Because they don't believe anything they say anyway, and they hate themselves. So it's like that kind of comports with, in their hearts they know they're wrong, Richard Brookhiser once said. Totally true. So look at the numbers. They never look at the next set of numbers, which is, okay, just take out white voters and just ask Latino voters or African American voters. Do you think we need a ton more immigration? And we need maybe we have about 1.1 million a year people coming in legally now. Let's double it to 2. How would you feel about that? They're not for that at all. What are they for? They're for what everybody is for, which is the ability to raise your own kids. If you want to win new voters to your party, stop with the identity politics crap and go with the universal appeals that, again, by their nature, appeal to everyone. And chief among them is the freedom to raise your own kids. Now, why don't people, the only people who get to raise their own kids are rich people. Like everyone in my neighborhood has a parent stay home for that, not forever, but for that period when your kids are little and, birth to school or whatever. There's a several-year period where most parents, if given the choice, not all, nothing compulsory here, but if given the choice, most will stay home to raise their own children. But most people can't do that because they can't afford it. The one person, I hate to say this out loud, but it's true, before she went completely nuts, who wrote a book on this, and it's a great book, was Elizabeth Warren. And she did an academic study. It's called The Two-Income Trap. She wrote it about 10 years ago, again, before she went crazy, or she was sort of crazy, but she makes a good point, which is that actually we have told young women that they have this moral obligation to work for some creepy big company, give their lives over to some business for the benefit of shareholders above their duty to their own family. And that's really the message of modern feminism. You have a moral obligation to serve the market before you serve your family. And conservatives, for reasons that I honestly don't understand, have been like, yeah, that sounds right. That's totally right. That sounds like liberation. It's not bondage or anything. Well, it is bondage, actually. It's a lie, and it destroys people. Why would you tell your own daughters that? Like, I think your daughter comes to you, my husband and I love to have children. No, I really think you have an obligation. There's a quarterly earnings report out, and you got to work for that. You're not a shareholder, but you got to work for that. And that's what we're telling everybody, and both sides are complicit in it. How about the Republican Party pivots just a little bit and says, no, we want a society where if you want to, you can afford to have a family on one income. Because, by the way, we had that only for like 100 years, and it worked pretty great. We don't have it anymore, and maybe you'd like that. Would you like that? That's not an abstract promise. That's a concrete promise. And who knows how you get there, but why not start with what you want? And that's what I want.
So at the end of your book, go ahead. At the end of your book, right? So you're this.
You made it to the end? You're the only one.
I know. Well, I can skip, If you, I expensed it too, so.
You're a good man.
You know, at the end of your book, you're this populist raging maniac now, despite your protestations. But you end your book saying, think about what they want, the people. If they start dying younger or killing themselves in large numbers, figure out why, care about them. If the majority is worried about something, listen. Give them back some of their power. If they have strong feelings about an issue, don't overrule them, even if, maybe especially if, their views seem reactionary. You can't force enlightenment by fiat. In a democracy, you can only persuade. And I think if that's populism, if that is raging populism that destroys countries, let's bring the fire. Let's do it.
Well, you don't have an option. You don't have an option. I mean, that's all. So what people forget is how rarely tried democracy has been. So between the Roman Republic and like the American Revolution, not a ton of democracies. What would be the number? Pretty much zero. Certainly none tried at scale. And so it's a new thing, and we're not exactly sure how it works. And there are a lot of very decent, Enlightenment thinkers, in fact, in Europe in the 18th century who looked over at America and were like, you know, that will devolve into dictatorship because that form of government just does, always. And these were not monarchists saying this. These were like, you know, people who wanted it to work but feared it wouldn't. So it's a very volatile form of government. We've had it for long enough that we never think that, but it's true. And the basic requirement of it is that you keep the broad middle fairly satisfied and also vested in the system. And when that stops happening, it's not, I'm not making a moral, I tend to be a bit of a moralizer and I'm embarrassed by it and I'm sorry. But I'm not actually making a moral case, I'm making a practical case. It's not sustainable. Venezuela will happen. Venezuela had, you know, it's one of those things that happened like not very far away. It's only one time zone away. And it's a big country, and it was destroyed. And no one has thought through for 5 minutes why that happened. Probably a lot of reasons it happened, but a main reason was, and it didn't have to happen. I mean, I went to Venezuela as a kid. It was a totally nice country. Caracas looked like San Diego, kind of, where I grew up. And they had a big middle class, and it had obviously the world's largest known oil reserves, and it had an educated population, a lot of really smart people in Venezuela. They're all in Miami now, adding to the economy there. And it was really simple. The broad middle of the country, including a lot of members of the middle class, decided that, you know, this wasn't working for them. A small group of people were running everything. I'm trying not to use the phrase income inequality, but that's what they were mad about. People are mad about that. Envy is a real thing. And they hired a guy who destroyed their ruling class and then destroyed the country. Now they don't have toilet paper and they're eating zoo animals. So like, that's not something that we should pay attention to? I think it is. I think a ton is at stake. I know everyone in Washington thinks Trump is just this weird orange anomaly who came out of nowhere and will, you know, exit to somewhere and then we'll get back to Bob Dole, and that's not going to happen at all. And so we should, I think, as conservatives and politically minded public policy people should be thinking about how to keep this from going really wrong.
Well, on that note, we have to wrap up. Just want to thank you.
Oh, man, thank you.
We also have coming up Jonah Goldberg and Rich Lowry debating nationalism, and Jim Buckley will be out after that. Thank you all so much, and we're going to duck out before you throw things at us. Thank you.
Thanks.